He didn't believe in miracles, not anymore. Not after months of sleeping in the driver's seat with his jacket for a blanket and his son tucked behind him like a fragile promise he kept rewrapping against the cold. Yet the day the letter arrived, the wind quieted as if to let the words land, and when he slit the envelope open with a bent key and read that an old woman had left him her house, his name printed clearly, no mistake, no scam, he felt something lift inside his chest and hover there, wary and bright, like a bird deciding whether this branch could hold its weight. By dusk, he had turned the wheel toward the coast where the address waited, the road unspooling through a weathered landscape of salt marsh and wind-bent pines, his son asleep with a stray dog's head pressed to his knee, a tin of coins rattling in the cup holder like a modest orchestra, and as the sky bruised over with low fog, he kept repeating the address under his breath, the way people once said prayers, so that by the time the highway dwindled into a 2-lane ribbon through dunes and scrub, the syllables felt like a place he belonged to already. He parked at the edge of a village that looked as though it had learned to speak in whispers. Clapboard houses squinting against the sea wind, a store with bells on the door, gulls patrolling the air like opinionated guardians, and followed the road that tilted toward water until a fence of gray pickets appeared, half lost to beach grass, and behind it, the house stood close to the shoreline, as if listening. A weathered cottage with cedar shingles gone silver, a porch with a swing that still remembered laughter, windows clouded with salt and thyme. A sign by the steps read, Whitlow in hand-painted script. The letters faded but careful, and though he had never known the old woman beyond a rumor his mother once shared, the generous widow at the edge of the world who baked bread for people she barely knew, he said her name aloud anyway, thank you. And the wind moved through the reeds as if to pass it along. The key from the lawyer clicked hesitant, and then, sure, the door breathing open with the soft surrender of wood that has resigned itself to both storms and sunlight. And inside, the light fell in delicate squares across the floorboards, dust drifting like quiet snow. The air smelled of lemon oil and tide, and he stood there with his son beside him and the dog nosing forward, feeling the uncanny sensation of stepping into a story that had been paused mid-sentence, a teacup on the table, a throw folded on a chair, a quilt draped over the back of a couch as though someone had just risen to answer the door and would be back in a minute. He said we're home because the boy was looking up at him with eyes wide enough to hold the whole room, and he needed to pin the moment to something solid, and the word startled him with how right it sounded. They walked through the rooms in a hush, kitchen with a farmhouse sink and jars labeled in careful script, living room with a shelf of books soft at the edges from being loved, a wall of photographs in black and white and sun-bleached color, a woman with a laugh caught mid-bloom, a man in a cap with hands that built things, a child playing in tide pools, and then, tucked in a corner frame, a picture of his mother young, hair wild in the wind, arms slung around the shoulder of the same laughing woman, and on the back, a note, for when it's time to come back. He had to sit down for a second, his knees suddenly new to this work of holding him, because time had folded without asking, and the stranger who had left him. This house was, in some gentle and stubborn way, part of the old map his life had been drawn from. He told his son about a summer long ago when his mother had come here to help an auntly friend recover after a storm, about stories of warm bread and sea glass and a porch where people told the truth without breaking. And the boy listened the way children do when the air itself is telling them to remember. Dusk settled like a shawl, and the first night tasted of soup heated on the stove and the hush of waves stitching the dark together. The dog, who had followed them since a truck stop 3 towns back and simply decided, curled at their feet as if he had always been assigned that job. The storm door creaked once. The house answered with a soft settling, and he lay awake for a while watching moonlight climb the wall, daring not to move in case the moment discovered itself and fled, until sleep found him like a tide easing around a rock. Morning was a pale blessing, fog ribboning the dunes, the window glass filmed with the breath of the sea. He made coffee that smelled like reprieve and found bread dough rising in a big chipped bowl covered by a flour sack towel, a note propped beside it in a looping hand. Knead, gently. Don't rush. Good bread forgives. He could hear the old woman's voice inside the words, not in sound, but in steadiness, and he and the boy pressed the dough and laughed when it pushed back, shaping 2 small loaves that would not impress anyone except the hungry. They took a tour of what the house knew. Drawers that held twine and rubber bands and old letters tied with ribbon. A drawer that clicked twice to open because the catch was shy. A pantry with a row of blue jars filled with buttons. Sea glass. Marbles that had not been played with in years and seemed patient about it. Upstairs, 1 bedroom faced the water with a bed set low like a boat and an Afghan that smelled faintly of lavender. Another room smaller with a window that framed a spruce. A desk with a half-sharpened pencil resting on a blank page, as if waiting for a sentence to finally land. On the second afternoon, the dog began pawing at a knot in the floor by the sideboard with the seriousness of an archaeologist who knows the story is beneath the dust, and when he pried the board up carefully, no damage, no hurry, he found a shallow cavity, and in it a tin with a lid dented into the shape of years. Inside the tin, a folded paper and a key that could never be mistaken for anything but a key to something older than hurry. The paper read, "If you are kind to this house, it will give you the rest. The key knows where." And there was no signature, because the tone was enough to identify the author. He walked the rooms with the key in his hand, feeling for the small pull in the air that tells you when you are close. And in the pantry behind the row of blue jars, he found the back panel that didn't quite ring true when tapped, a slight echo under its wood, and behind it, a narrow door painted the same soft white as the walls, the key sliding home with the relief of something returned. The door opened to a steep set of steps descending between plaster and chimney to a cellar that smelled of stone and tide, and at the bottom, a space that did not try to be anything else. Workbench scarred with a history of repairs, shelves lined with preserves that had gone to sugar and memory, and across the far wall, a series of cubbies labeled with those careful letters: pliers, sandpaper, twine, prayers. The last cubby empty, except for a small wooden box, stamped with an anchor. He lifted the lid and found a bundle of letters wrapped in a linen handkerchief and a journal bound in oilskin. The first letter addressed to his mother, in that same looping, patient hand. Darling girl, if he ever makes it back to the shoreline of himself, give him this key. And if you are the one reading, then forgive me my old stubbornness. I wanted him to find it when he needed it and not a minute before. The journal began in storm season 30 years earlier and moved through winters and repairs and weddings and memorials, through recipes and advice and notes to self, through patient prayers for someone unnamed and then named in an aside, his own name with a question mark after it, as if a wish had scribbled itself in the margin to become braver later. Over the next days, he learned the house through the journal's gentle instructions, how the front door sticks against northeast rain and will behave if you talk to it, how the roofline along the porch wants a new length of flashing and gratitude, how the weak board in the back stair sings in the same key as the wind and can be quieted with a nail of the right length and a dab of soap on the tip, how the gull that seems to be laughing at you is not wrong, how the beach keeps returning what is lost if you walk early and long enough. He read at night with the boy drowsing against his shoulder and the dog sighing like an old sailor at his feet, and in the margins he found sketches of a map of the yard and beyond, a loop through the spruces to a little bluff where the clay shows, red, after storms, and a note. Dig here, not for riches, but for remembering. When they went at low tide with a shovel that had been leaning against the fence for a decade, waiting to be useful again, they found at that bluff among the tough roots and red earth a small tin soldier, a brooch shaped like a wave, a fishing float the color of sea lightning, and a sealed jar with a note rolled inside. To whoever needs it, the sea takes and the sea gives. Do not hoard, do not despair. The boy held the float to the light as if to drink in its color and said we should put half back. And he did. And the lesson settled into the air between them, like a third conscience. Work became prayer, small and steady, patching shingles while the wind sang the old song through the combs of the reeds, planing a stubborn door until it forgave the frame, sanding the porch rail until it felt like a wave smoothed by years, his hands remembering the language of fixing as if his muscles had been waiting for commands kinder than survival. The boy helped by handing him screws like treasure and naming the gulls with outrageous names, and the dog shepherded them both with the seriousness of a creature who knows all miracles are practical at ground level. The miracle itself did not arrive as thunder or light splitting the sky. It seeped in through small proofs, the way sleep came without argument, the way the boy's laughter rang in a key the house seemed built to hold, the way strangers on the lane began to nod at them with the specific friendliness reserved for people the village has decided to keep, the way the old storekeeper began saving aside bruised fruit, for them wrapped in newspaper with a note. Try these for jam, the way the postal clerk slipped a bundle of yellowed envelopes across the counter with a conspiratorial look. Found these in the back. Must be yours now. And the way those envelopes carried more of the story in that familiar hand. Notes to his mother about learning to stay, about leaving before staying could break her, and a final unsent letter addressed to him, years before he'd ever needed it. If you come to the edge and the sea does not frighten you, stay, because fear is sometimes the last disguise of hope. He found in the oilskin journal a page marked with a pressed sprig of beach pea and a diagram of the house's bones, with an arrow to the floor beneath the stove, and a simple caption, "The old house has a second heart." He lifted the stove with a careful lever, slid the loose board aside, and discovered beneath the joists a boxed-in cavity holding a tin of cash, likely saved one careful bill at a time. A stack of grocery ledgers with notes like, "Deliver to Miss Hart, no charge," and a folded paper that made his breath catch. A deed transferring the house to his name dated months earlier than the letter that had found them, along with a line that read, "I am not leaving this to you out of pity. I am leaving it because a house chooses who can hear it, and you are your mother's son." He took the deed and walked to the lawyer in town who wore a tie like a soft apology, and stamped it again and nodded and said, "Welcome home," in a voice that sounded like the old woman's kitchen, and he returned to the cottage and stood in the doorway. Because the journal had instructed, "Always tell the house when something important happens." It listened through storms before you arrived, and it will keep listening after. The boy began to sleep through the night without the small cry that had haunted highway shoulders and parking lots. The dog learned the tide schedule as if born to it, and he learned the faces of the locals. Lobsterman with hands like stories, teacher who believed in small miracles, the quiet carpenter who stopped by to say a beam in the shed was tired and he would be back Thursday with a fix, because some things are worth more than money. And when he arrived, he took nothing but a slice of bread and a soft thank you. On a morning sown white with fog, a stranger stood at the gate, a woman with the kind of stillness the sea teaches, and when he stepped onto the porch, she said, "Your mother and I were girls together here once, and we promised each other if one of us ever needed to come back, the other would make sure there was still a door." She held out a small package wrapped in oilcloth, and inside he found a photograph of his mother on this very porch, holding a baby he had never seen because the baby was him. The old woman's arm wrapped around them both, a triangle of care so obvious he had to sit down again. The back of the photograph read, "You cried and then fell asleep when the sea breathed. So did your mother. So will you." The house, having waited, now began to speak in ways only steady places can. The rhythm of the kettle, announcing company you didn't expect. A draft at the knee, reminding you of a gap the wind could find until you fixed it. The exact place where the sun slipped into the kitchen at late afternoon, making the table glow like something blessed. He talked to it because the old woman's notes had told him to, saying, "Thank you," when the latch finally caught. Sorry when he dropped a cup and it broke like brittle sunlight. I hear you when it creaked at night, not as complaint, but as recollection. He did not become a different man. Suddenly, he simply became the one he had been before the world had taught him to run on fumes. The father who could now say yes, more often than not. The worker who could see a broken hinge and imagine a hinge that worked. The listener who could hold silence without filling it with worry. Sometimes, when fog wrapped the dunes and the gulls wrote fast gray script across the sky, he would take the journal to the porch and read aloud a page at random, and the boy would ask questions that tightened knots the old woman had begun to tie and left ready for them. Why do we fix things instead of buying new? Because fixing is a way of staying. Why do we share what we find? Because hoarding is how fear keeps talking. Why do we say thank you to rooms? Because gratitude teaches walls to hold more light. On the 7th evening, a storm pushed in with the old authority, rain hard as thrown pebbles, wind shouldering the house to see if it still meant what it said, and he moved through the rooms, checking windows and latches, talking to the old wood. "Steady now. We know this dance." And when the power went, he lit the oil lamp. he had cleaned that afternoon, the light lifting up the beams into cathedral. The boy and dog curled on the rug with cards and a book, the house steadying under the hand of weather as it had so many times before. In the middle of that storm, he understood the phrase second heart, because something beneath the floor seemed to beat in patient counterpoint to the wind, and he knew he had inherited not just a structure, but a rhythm. In the morning, the world wore salt like sequins, and the beach was a fresh script. And when they walked the tide line, they found what storms leave for those who will look. Lengths of rope, a crate thinned by waves into lace, driftwood that wanted to become a bench, and the boy discovered a bottle with a note inside, cliché as a storybook, and just as true. They opened it at the kitchen table and unrolled the paper that had traveled. Who knows how far to say a single sentence? If this finds you, pass forward something that mattered to you. And the boy said, "Can we give the carpenter my old watch?" And he did. And the carpenter cried, and the house took in that small kindness and held it the way beams hold lamps. As days lengthened and the sun learned the exact shape of the porch again, people began to appear at the gate with stories that made the old woman present without using her name. The loaf she left when winter took a job before rent did. The bed she offered in storm season to a stranger who left a bouquet of shells in return. The way she wrote letters for men whose hands shook too much to ask for help. He wrote each story into the journal she had started, pages now bearing two handwritings, the old looping one and his steadier print. And when the boy asked why, he said, because a house is only as strong as the stories we remember inside it, and remembering is a kind of building too. The miracle, if anyone had asked him later, was not that an old woman had left a house to a man who had run out of road, nor that the house had held cash, or a key, or a secret pantry door, nor even that the village had taken them in, as if they had washed ashore and matched the coastline. The miracle was simpler and heavier, that the house had kept a space ready for their lives to set down, and that, once set down, those lives could begin to grow again toward the light, that grief could be composted into patience, fear turned into careful work, hunger into loaves that, however ugly, disappeared fast and smiling. And sometimes at night, when fog pressed its soft forehead to the glass and the distant bellboy spoke like a slow metronome, he would lie awake beside the breathing of his son and the long sighs of the dog and say aloud to the ceiling, to the cedar, to the invisible scaffolding of care that had held through storms he hadn't earned, "I will keep this, I will keep this, I will keep this," hearing the house answer in its jointed language, yes, and yes, and yes. He had long stopped believing in miracles, yet the house insisted they existed, not in lightning or divine gestures, but in the small consistencies that stitched life back together. Every morning, the same creak warned him of rain before clouds arrived. Sunlight traced its familiar square on the kitchen table right when the dough finished rising. The walls seemed to breathe with the tide, exhaling peace into rooms that once held only survival. Over time, gratitude turned into responsibility. He no longer thought, "We got lucky." He began to think, "We've been trusted." The sea returned close again that spring, testing their new belonging. He walked the perimeter, replacing swollen boards on the porch just as the journal instructed, the boy handing him nails one by one, learning that the right length of a nail wasn't about metal, but about kindness to wood. The dog supervised, patient and grave. Slow means strong, he'd say, and the boy nodded like an apprentice to an ancient craft. By then, the villagers no longer called them newcomers. They were simply the ones who fixed things. The blacksmith charged only 2 loaves of bread for the new hinges, whispering about a widow by the docks whose roof was leaking. He nodded. Tomorrow, then. That's how their quiet contagion began, not announced, not advertised, just spreading like warmth from one pair of hands to another. Each week, he fixed something that wasn't his, a door that didn't close, a gutter that sang in storms, a broken latch. His son held the ladder, the dog kept watch, and the neighbors learned to smile again. Gratitude in their eyes slowly became something deeper. Participation, perhaps even belief. It's been years since this smelled like fresh paint, one woman said, running her fingers over the window frame. He smiled, not answering. In the evenings, when wind carried laughter from other porches, he read another page of the oilskin journal aloud, hearing the old woman's calm wisdom slip between his own words until the lines no longer felt like instructions, but gentle reminders about the balance between mine and ours. One day, while cleaning the attic, they found a small wooden box filled with lace, buttons, and a note. If the house ever feels too small to hold your kindness, open the far gate. That's where music used to enter. He had never noticed a far gate. It hid behind wild roses. But when he looked for it, it was as if the house itself turned his head. Beyond it lay a forgotten path winding toward a half-collapsed gazebo near the shore, its round roof peeled by storms, benches sunken in sand, a single rusted lantern still hanging from a beam. The sight stopped him. He could almost see children spinning circles in the dusk, laughter rising like tide foam. Someone playing violin beneath the lantern's shadow. He knew without thinking. The house has grown beyond us. He began to clean. Sand first, then weeds, then rust. He propped the old lantern upright, rewired it using a solar panel a fisherman had traded him for fixing his engine. His son installed a switch and declared the place for quiet talks. The dog, naturally, claimed the entrance as her throne. The first visitors came uninvited, a boy with a half-strung guitar, the widow with an apple pie, the schoolteacher with a box of crayons. They sat under the arch as dusk melted to violet, no one playing yet, no one speaking much, just listening to the hum of the sea. A week later, a woman in a blue coat arrived, violin case in hand. "Your house," she said softly, "feels like the edge of fear. The good kind. May I?" When she drew the bow, the first note carried straight through the boards and windows and settled in the kitchen where bread was rising again. He realized then that the house had expanded from kitchen to garden, from garden to gazebo, from gazebo into every heart within reach. Each discovery led to another. He found secret compartments the old woman had built, a shelf that opened from both sides, a latch that had a summer position, a board that lifted to reveal a folded table labeled "for gathering." Every part of the house carried a whisper. If children come with paint, if someone forgets how to pray, if the power fails, here's what to do. Every if was an invitation, and one day, the if arrived. That night, the entire village went dark. The wind paused, waiting. Somewhere down the lane, a baby cried. He remembered the drawing in the journal. A spare wire, a hidden inverter under the stove. He connected it to the fisherman's spare battery, fed the line through the garden, and the old lantern at the gazebo flared awake, golden and trembling. One by one, neighbors appeared through the mist, shapes of worry turned into silhouettes of awe. They gathered quietly under the light, speaking in low voices, holding mugs of tea he'd brewed on the stove. "Home?" someone whispered. And for the first time, he believed it wasn't just his home. It was theirs. When dawn returned and the electric lines hummed again, he noticed footprints leading back to every door in the village. Someone had left a note on the gate. "Thank you for sheltering our fear and giving it back as light." The miracles no longer surprised him, but they still humbled him. One morning, a yellowed envelope slid from behind a picture frame. Inside was another deed, this time for the empty lot next door, and a single line in that same patient handwriting, for a garden, for those who've forgotten what June smells like. He didn't even sigh. He only smiled and said aloud, "Understood." With the school teacher's help and the children who now called the gazebo theirs, they cleared the ground of weeds and salt grass. They planted lavender, thyme, nasturtiums, even a crooked row of strawberries. He built the beds in waves so they mimicked the sea. His son lined the paths with shells, and the dog approved each patch of shade personally. Their first harvest was small, a handful of beans, a sprig of mint, one tiny carrot. But it tasted like rebirth. From then on, every soup in the kitchen bore the signature. From the garden. People started bringing more than seeds. They brought their silences. The teenager who stopped talking after his father's accident, the widower who hadn't spoken since the funeral, the girl too shy to show her drawings. The garden never judged. The herbs whispered evenly to all who came. Bees offered their quiet approval. He noticed the air itself changing, replaced bitterness with the earthy scent of new growth. Inside, the house grew warmer too. The smell of salt and dust faded into the scent of bread, soap, and drying linen. The shelf of old coins became a shelf of jam jars. The ledger of worries turned into a book of recipes and guest notes. For every jar opened, tell a story, one entry read, and so they did. The villagers, once cautious, began showing up with knowledge. The fisherman taught the children how to read tide charts. The retired postman recited poems he'd written on his route. The widowed teacher led evenings of gentle wisdom, where each person spoke about something they knew by heart: sewing, maps, stars, patience. He never chaired those evenings. He only watched as laughter replaced the old sound of creaking floors. Autumn came hard that year. The storms arrived with a vengeance, pushing waves nearly to the porch. He remembered the old woman's notes. Latch the shutters, bring in the herbs, speak softly to the roof. He followed every word. As the storm screamed, he moved room to room, steadying lamps, whispering, "Easy, now." You've done this before. The wind tested every nail. The house answered with steady defiance. By dawn, the storm had spent itself. The village looked bruised, shingles missing, fences bowed, nets tangled. But their cottage stood whole, the garden bent yet unbroken, lavender still clinging to its scent. He brewed coffee and carried 2 mugs outside. His son joined him barefoot, the dog nosing the damp air. "We made it," the boy said. "We did," he answered. "And so did everyone else, thanks to her." He looked toward the sea and whispered, "You built this to last, didn't you?" The waves replied in applause. In the weeks that followed, the gazebo turned into a gathering place again. Now, not just for music, but for rebuilding. Roofers, teachers, children, strangers, everyone brought a hammer or a song. He realized the old woman's final miracle wasn't giving them shelter. It was teaching them to give it away. The next spring, the garden doubled. They built raised beds for the elderly who couldn't kneel. They added benches painted in every color of the sea. The dog adopted 3 kittens and a one-eyed seagull that refused to leave. Laughter became the new weather. One afternoon, as he was trimming the rosemary, he found his son sitting by the gazebo with a notebook. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Her story," the boy said. "And ours. What will you call it?" "The House That Listens." He smiled. "It does, doesn't it?" That night, under a sky as clear as forgiveness, the boy read aloud what he'd written, about a house that heard footsteps before fear, a man who thought he'd lost everything, and a woman who'd planned miracles quietly through carpentry and trust. When he finished, the man felt something release, the last knot of disbelief loosening. "You've done what you wanted," he said softly. You remembered out loud. Years passed like seasons in a tide pool, brief, shimmering, always returning. The house aged, its shingles silvering further, its porch posts carved with initials of visitors. Travelers left coins, drawings, and letters in the mailbox, each beginning with, "I heard about the house by the sea." He kept every note in a chest under the stairs. Some nights he'd read them aloud, the words overlapping, like voices of a long conversation that never needed to end. When the local paper interviewed him for the last time, he said, "It wasn't charity. It was an inheritance of courage." He looked toward the garden, where children chased each other between lavender rows. "She gave us a place to practice being kind. That's all." Years later, when his hair had turned white and his hands trembled too much for hammers, he'd sit on the porch with his son, now grown, now the caretaker, and say, "Remember how it all started? With $5 in a stranger's name?" The son would laugh. "She wasn't a stranger, Dad. She was family we hadn't met yet." On the day he passed, the sky held that strange color between storm and calm, the same light that first led them here. The boy, now a man, found a final note tucked in the oilskin journal. The handwriting wavered, but was still strong. Every house that listens eventually learns to sing. Keep it singing. That evening, as the tide came in, the village gathered. Lamps glowed in every window. The violinist returned, now older, her notes gliding through salt air. The dog, old, slow, but faithful, lay at the steps. The man's son read a passage from the journal. Hope doesn't shout. It hums under the floorboards. When he closed the book, silence held for a moment. Then someone began to hum. Another joined. Then another. The sound built. Not loud, just certain. When the wind shifted, carrying their song across the sea, a single gull circled above the house and disappeared into the light. And those who were there swore. They saw, for an instant, the lantern in the gazebo flare, brighter than it ever had before, as if the house itself, after all these years, had finally learned to sing.